Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition, a long-awaited Aether Revolt is finally here edition of Budget Magic. So, I haven't been this excited to play a deck in a long time. I am just super excited for Aether Revolt and Brewing, and there's so many cards I love, and I am super excited for this deck. This is Paradox Engine combo for Standard, and this deck it's just absurd. It is an infinite combo deck, essentially, that we have in Standard that is actually really powerful. We draw our old deck, we do so many crazy things. I'm in love with this deck. The best news is the deck is $55 in the paper world, 18 ticks on Magic Online. So an alternate title for this deck could be Going Infinite in Aether Revolt Standard for only $50. So this is as cheap as it gets. And while the deck can struggle here and there in some matchups, it's really powerful. And if we can just goldfish for a few turns, the deck is almost guaranteed to win the game. So a quick reminder before we break down the deck. If you enjoy Budget Magic and you enjoy this Paradox Engine deck, it would be super spectacularly awesome of you if you could take a second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's talk Paradox Engine Wombo combo. So Paradox Engine, I have been excited for this card since it was spoiled. This card just seems like it's screaming to be broken, and I'm sure there's tons of crazy things even beyond what our deck is doing with it. But basically, 5 mana legendary artifact. Whenever we cast a spell, we untap all the non-land permanents we control. So we cast a spell, we untap everything, and there's some really easy ways to go around breaking this card, and that's kinda the idea of this deck. People mention like creatures and Cryptolith Rites and stuff like that, but we've went another direction, maybe even a better direction, where we're kind of taking advantage of a mono blue artifact based shell. So importantly, we also have Whir of Invention, which is one of the key cards to this deck. Since we get a bunch of artifacts, we can improvise using the artifacts to tap for mana, essentially, like you would with Chord of Calling almost, and tutor the Paradox Engine out of our deck. So we've seen in the past, like, some of our decks, we played Aetherflux Reservoir and Against the Odds. We've played Panharmonicon. Those decks are awesome when they have their namesake card, but they can kind of struggle when you don't have your namesake card. And this deck is very much like that. We're extremely built around Paradox Engine. We really need a Paradox Engine for our deck to do anything, and thankfully we get a lot of card draw, but Whir of Invention is a way we can just tutor a Paradox Engine out of our library at instant speed at the end of our opponent's turn when they tap out to do something to get around counters, and it doesn't get hit by Ceremonious Rejection because it's not a colorless spell, so it just does everything for this deck. So that's its kind of main purpose, is to be copies 5 through 8 of Paradox Engine, but it also tutors out a bunch of other things that we'll talk about as we go along, because we're just overloaded on artifacts. So how do we actually go infinite with Paradox Engine? And here the key cards are Hedron Archive and Cultivator's Caravan. So to really go infinite, we want at least 2 of these on the battlefield. The more the better, but the way this works is we get a Paradox Engine out, maybe with Whir of Invention, and then we have a Hedron Archive, maybe a Cultivator's Caravan, so we can tap all of our mana artifacts, so a couple mana from Hedron Archive, a mana from Cultivator's Caravan, and then we cast a spell. And then when we cast that spell, we untap our mana rocks, we tap them again, float the mana, tap something else. Ideally, we'll get to the point where each time we cast a spell, that spell is actually gaining us a bunch of mana. If we have, let's say, 2 Hedron Archives, a couple of Cultivators Caravans, that means we can float 6 mana, cast a 2 mana spell, untap everything. That 2 mana spell is actually gaining us 4 mana. So we essentially get an infinite amount of mana, and the rest of our deck is a lot of card draw spells, so we draw cards and keep untapping, and eventually all that mana we net gives us just essentially an infinite amount of mana. It's not truly infinite, there is a finite number, but we have so much mana that we can never spend it, and that's how we end up winning the game. So these cards are really key. Once we have Paradox Engine, they are the second piece of the combo. It's kind of possible to go like semi-infinite with 1 Hedron Archive. We really want a Cultivator's Caravan because blue mana is important. However, we have another card that kind of helps with that. Prophetic Prism and Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot do 2 different things for the deck. On level 1, we cast them on turn 2, they draw us a card. They also tap for our Improvise effects, so they kind of add mana on the battlefield. And they help us gain a lot of mana once we're comboing off. If we have just a single Hedron Archive with our Paradox Engine, we can cast Prophetic Prisms and Metal Spinners Puzzle Knots for free, because we tap Hedron Archive, cast our 2-mana artifact, it untaps Hedron Archive. Once we have more of those, a couple Hedron Archives or a Cultivator's Caravan, these are the cards that are not only drawing us another card, but they're netting us. They're like Ultra Rituals. They're gaining us 3 mana, 4 mana, 6 mana, and this is how we cycle through our entire deck. Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot, when things go wrong, we can always sack it to draw an extra card so we don't fizzle. The other important thing of Prophetic Prism is our deck does need blue mana. We need it for Whir of Invention, some of our other card draw spells. And one of the situations where we can get in trouble is when we're comboing off with just Hedron Archives. If we don't have Cultivator's Caravan, say we have, let's say, 3 Hedron Archives. That's awesome. We cast a 2-mana spell. We're netting 4 mana because we tap all the Hedron Archives in between. The problem is we're only getting colorless mana, but Prophetic Prism solves that. So we add an extra step into our tapping. We tap all of our Hedron Archives, float a bunch of colorless mana, tap our Prophetic Prisms, turn some of that colorless mana into blue mana that's floating. And then when we cast our spell, we're actually kind of getting blue mana from our colorless Hedron Archive. So in some ways, Prophetic Prism can replace Cultivator's Caravan in the combo. Cultivator's Caravan is still more important because it actually adds mana, but being able to transform Hedron Archive mana into blue mana is actually really important in some situations. So then, kind of the payoff for all this is our big card draw effects. And once we have maybe 2 or 3 mana rocks along with the Paradox Engine, these cards are either free and draw us a bunch of cards, or they're actually netting us mana in some scenarios. Reverse Engineer is just absurd in this deck. It's blue mana hungry, which is what we were just talking about with the Prophetic Prism, but we have Metal Spinners Puzzle Knots, random artifacts sitting around, even the Paradox Engine itself. And we're able to tap all those artifacts, so it's 2 mana, draw 3 cards. We can use the Prophetic Prism for the blue mana, and then when we cast it, all of our artifacts untap, so we can do it again, so we can kind of chain these together. Glimmer draws us 2 cards, but the Scrying helps make sure they're relevant cards, get some lands to the bottom of the deck. That's kind of how we can potentially fizzle with this deck, is we draw a big string of lands in a row, and we're unable to keep casting spells and comboing off and untapping all of our stuff, so being able to scry is really helpful there. Cogworker's Puzzle Knot looks weird, but it's actually kind of important to our deck. So it does a couple of things. One thing is we don't have much defense, so it gives us a 1/1 colorless chump blocker. And our deck, it's kind of turn 5/turn 6 is where we usually win. We're really consistent in winning at turn 6. We're sometimes can win on turn 5 with our best draws. So occasionally just chump blocking for 1 turn with our servo token helps let us survive just long enough to combo off. The other thing is it makes 2 artifacts. We get the Cogworker's Puzzle Knot itself plus the servo, which just so happens to be exactly the amount of mana we need to be able to improvise our Reverse Engineer. So on turn 2 we play Cogworker's Puzzle Knot. On turn 3 we have 3 mana, draw 3 with Reverse Engineer, which is super strong. It also powers up our Whir of Invention, like Cogworker's Puzzle Knot on turn 2, maybe another one on turn 3. On turn 4, we're getting to the point where we have enough artifacts and enough lands that we can potentially just Whir of Invention out of our Paradox Engine and start going to town and winning the game. So it's really key for that. Chump blocking, adding mana with the Whir of Invention. Also, we want 2 mana spells because we like those cheap spells to gain us mana once we're comboing off with Paradox Engine in the mana rocks. Then Quicksmith Spy is just one of, but it's super awesome. It basically allows us to draw our entire deck. So we're comboing off with the Paradox Engine, our mana. We're casting all these card draw spells. Sooner or later, we'll draw the Quicksmith Spy. We cast the Quicksmith Spy. We use its ability targeting Paradox Engine. So now we have a Paradox Engine that can tap itself to draw a card. So we tap Paradox Engine, draw a card, cast a spell, untaps all our mana rocks and our Paradox Engine, which gains us a bunch of mana. We draw another card with Paradox Engine. So once we get the Quicksmith Spy out, it's very difficult to fizzle because any spell we cast is not only gaining us a ton of mana, it's also drawing us an extra card. So our Prophetic Prism is drawing us 2 cards. Our Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot 2 cards, and we just keep going and going until we draw our whole deck. As far as actually winning the game, we have one way to do it. We have a single copy of Aetherflux Reservoir. Of course, it's kind of like we have 5 Aetherflux Reservoirs because we can tutor them up with Whir of Invention. So we go through this combo, we cast a bunch of spells. Eventually, we will Whir of Invention for an Aether Flux Reservoir. By that point, we've probably already cast 8 or 10 spells in a turn, so we just cast a couple more spells, gain 11 life, gain 12 life, gain 13 life, and then 50 our opponent with Aether Flux Reservoir. It's ideal to be able to Whir of Invention for it, because if Whir gets countered, everything's fine. If we happen to have Aether Flux Reservoir in our hand, it's a little sketchy. We do have a bunch of counters in the sideboard, but we don't really have any in the main deck, so it's possible that our opponent could counter it if they save it up, but in practice, that doesn't really happen. Normally, our opponent's going to be trying to counter our other stuff to keep from getting to this point, because they don't know how we're going to win the game, so they usually use their counters to try to stop our Paradox Engine or some of our card draw spells, and then once we get the Aether Flux Reservoir, it's very impossible to lose. As far as the mana base, we get a couple of Inventor's Fair, which gives us an additional tutor for Paradox Engine, for our Aether Flux Reservoir, for card draw if we start to fizzle when we're comboing off. A Blighted Cataract can also draw us cards, and then some islands. As far as the sideboard, we basically have two things. Stuff to protect our combo in Dispel, Negate, and Unsubstantiate. So this is to fight through control matchups where our opponent has a bunch of counter spells, to stop artifact removal, especially instant speed artifact removal that could ruin our combo. Unsubstantiate does a cool remand trick, kind of like you see in Modern, where we can, let's say, cast a Prophetic Prism, untap all of our stuff, maintain priority, cast Unsubstantiate, targeting Prophetic Prism, untap all of our stuff to generate even more mana. We get the Prophetic Prism back to our hand, cast it again, untap all of our stuff a third time, so it can kind of be a mana generator as well in a pinch. And then we have stuff to try to stay alive, so we don't really have much interaction in the main deck, which means the biggest way we lose is we just get run over. If our opponents have a really aggressive deck and have a really aggressive draw where it's like 1-drop Toolcraft Exemplar, 2-drop Heart of Kirin, 3-drop DePaula, draws like that are what can get us. But Warping Whale helps keep us alive in those scenarios. Engulf the Shore is kind of like Super Fog that bounces everything, hopefully buys us an extra turn, because like I said before, if we can live till turn 6 for sure, occasionally turn 5, our odds of winning is incredibly high. We're very consistent in comboing off at that time. The challenge is making sure we live that long, and against the most aggressive decks in Standard, sometimes we just don't live that long. They just out goldfish us, because we're not really interacting with them. They're not really interacting with us, but if they can kill us on turn 4, then our goldfishing doesn't matter. So these cards come in and help save us there. And that is Ultra Budget Paradox Engine for Aether Revolt Standard, and that's our budget magic for this week. And I have to say, this deck is just a blast. I don't know if I've ever gotten so many comments from people that I played against with this deck, win or lose. It looks really cool, it plays really cool. When you combo off, it almost feels like Modern Eggs, where you have this like 10-minute turn where you just draw your entire deck and cast so many spells, and your opponent can't really scoop because they think there's a chance that you're fizzling, and there always is a chance, but it's very, very rare that this deck actually fizzles once we get to the point where we have 2 or 3 mana rocks and the Paradox Engine. It's very rare that that actually happens. We get enough card draw to keep going, so tons of interesting comments. It's a really unique and fun deck. Anyway, give it a shot. I don't think you'll be disappointed, because win or lose is just a blast. That's our budget magic for this week. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon.